Hey everybody, it's Bishop Megan Rohrer, and we are back with the Bishop's Book Club and talking about trauma today. So, trigger warning for anyone who is not up for talking about trauma today. You can find something else on social media or watch this at another time when you feel more up for it. We might be talking about things that involve sexual violence. We might be talking about things that involve disasters, particularly disasters related to fires. So if that is more than you have the steam for today, see you later. But if you're up for it, we'll be discussing a really wonderful book called After Trauma Lessons on Overcoming from a First Responder turned Crisis Counselor, who is here with us. Special guest, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Allie Rothrock. I am an author, first responder, crisis counselor, entrepreneur, too many things, but those are the main ones. I'm happy to be here.
Do you want to explain a little bit about the type of first responder that you are or
Sure.
have been?
Sure. Yeah. So I joined the volunteer fire service in 2005, and I became a volunteer EMT about 3 years after that. So I've been in and around fire trucks and ambulances and all of that for like over half of my life at this point. So that gave me this beautiful foundation of experiences and skill sets that I've been able to transition into this crisis counselor role that I love, and being able to be with first responders after they've experienced sort of the worst of the worst is like my deepest honor and privilege, and I love to do that work.
And do I recall reading in here that around the age of 5, you helped put out a bale of hay?
That was my very first experience as a firefighter. So I was 16.
Yeah.
I wish I was
16.
5.
Okay.
That would have been cooler. But yeah, 16.
In my brain, you were littler.
Yeah. That was my very first experience in fire gear, and it was a bale of hay. So good memory there.
Yeah, very good. All right. Well, we start off some of these things by asking people to explain some of the different type of intersectional ways that they embody life on this earth. What are some of the ways that you define yourself?
I define myself in the professional space really as a storyteller. That sort of checks all of the boxes of my own stories, and I love to help people find their ways to their own stories through finding their own words for their own stories and their own life experiences, good, bad, or otherwise. And so storyteller for me is really the way that I see the world, always through, telling stories and writing things down. I am sitting in front of a bookcase that has 102 journals of mine. On them I write every single day. And so that's a really big part of my life. And then, being in the first responder community for so long, I see a lot of my conversations and a lot of my work through that lens. And if you haven't been a first responder, or you just see the world of, like Ladder 49 and Chicago PD and all of those things, that's so not really what the job and what the environment is like. But so much of my work and so much of my passion comes from being in that space, being, both as a first responder and someone who loves that world and the people who do that job as well.
When I, prior to being elected bishop, in one of the roles that I had in the world, served as a community chaplain coordinator for the San Francisco Police Department, which meant that I helped train folk of all sorts of faith varieties, lay and ordained, in how they can care for first responders and dispatchers and victims advocates for the DA's office. We cared for people in the medical examiner's office, and how we could go to a scene or an emergency or something behind yellow tape and care for those who are experiencing grief, so that the first responders can do the first responder parts of the job,
Right.
And know that once they leave a scene, they're leaving behind kind of the wellness and care support that's needed. But also got trained up in all of those nerdy things, both the intensive kind of clinical traumatology side of healing with trauma care, somatic experiencing for those who know that sort of modality, compassion fatigue, psychological first aid, critical incident stress management, and debriefs that people do. And basically, whatever these acronyms are, or whatever way you talk about trauma, or whether you call it stress because it's part of your work and it's going to happen to you so often that you don't ever have a break from it, or it's trauma, which is an independent incident that happens and then you heal, and then maybe it happens again and it's unexpected. It, some ways it's very similar in the body, and in some ways it's very different. But with people who are in kind of a first responder mode, they can be having kind of activations of chemicals that are helping them feel up, like the adrenaline and the cortisol that you get when you're about to birth a baby.
Mm-hmm.
Just from hearing two tones from a firefighter station,
Oh, yeah.
or from the radio going off, or from the noises that happen in the dispatcher's ear. Or it could be those really real life things that happen to you, the ways that people are inflicting gender violence on each other, because all workplaces need that kind of care and support. And regardless of where your trauma comes from, I think what I appreciated is that you tell lots of different types of trauma stories. It's you are a first responder and you have been around disasters, but you really did a good job, I think, of talking about lots of different types of traumas, everything from a car accident to something that's very intense. Usually some of the most intense for first responders is if there's a kid involved.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I appreciated that.
Yeah, thank you. And that was something that I really was striving to do, was tell more than just my own story, and to tell more than just types of stories like mine. And you mentioned calls involving children. That's how my experience in the emergency services got kicked off. When I was 16, my very first fire call, right out of the gate, I did not know the different types of fire trucks. I did not know CPR. I did not understand anything. My very first experience on the scene of an incident was a fatal car accident where a 5-year-old child was killed. And I saw her come out of the car, and I saw people do CPR on her, and I saw her little body. And that was so formative for me, because it was my first experience with seeing something like that and immediately realizing, oh, there's nothing for us here. SISM wasn't a thing. Critical incident stress management wasn't a thing. Debriefing was not a thing. Peer support was not a thing. We had see you for the next call, and we took our gear off and went home. That's what I saw the people around me doing. So that's what I did. And so that wasn't traumatic for me in the way of the little girl, but it was very formative for me, because it showed me all the work that we still have to do when it comes from the on-the-job experiences, that first responders, we're not trained of what to do after. We're not trained of what to do. What do you do with those memories? What do you do with how the things that you see in the constant sleep disruption and those adrenaline spikes, all of that, the cumulative stress, the compassion fatigue, the burnout, COVID, how does that affect us both on the job and off? One of the companies that I run has that name for that very reason. So that is such an important thing to think about, is what is that after look like? And, my story is my story. I only have that one experience, but I wanted to talk about things that were different to me. So we have, people that experienced like a mass shooting or domestic violence. We have a trauma chaplain, James, whose story I covered. People who experienced trauma one time, or it was a slow sort of drip over a long period of time. I appreciate that you think there was sort of a variety, because that's what I really sought to encompass in the book.
Yeah, and I just think in times like this, there are some people who feel like, well, what I experience isn't as bad as that other thing I just saw on CNN yesterday. So maybe it's not okay that I'm having this deep feeling. And I think you write in a way that I think embodies what I think is the heart of kind of chaplain work, or people who are caring for people in the midst of emergencies, is that we define trauma based on how it affects you, not based on what it was that happened. Because for one person, 70% of people at the same incident might not have any effects that last more than 2 months, which is when it's a post-traumatic stress kind of situation. And it might be that, like, watching something almost happen to your dog is something that sticks with you deeper than being closer to something else. And it really depends on culture and smells and scents and sounds and all the stuff
you have, what your home life is like, what, it's so subjective. And there's a chapter in the book called, it's like, don't play the trauma Olympics. That's what I call it. It's like, Some people are going to have a gold medal in the trauma Olympics, but that doesn't mean that the thing that happened to you doesn't also matter. And so much of my work is around just that validation of, that's where my own trauma recovery started, was a trauma therapist telling me this was as bad as you feel that it was, and it's okay that you're as affected as you are. Like, that changed the trajectory of my whole life, just that validation. And like with dispatchers, for example, a lot of my work with people in that discipline is just validating that just because you are only hearing something doesn't mean it's not trauma. And so much of my work is just around that validation and not comparing your experience to someone else's, because it just doesn't compare.
Yeah, none of it compares. And sometimes the helplessness you have sitting in a cubicle, only hearing something but not being able to help, is a different amount of.
I can't imagine that stress. I can't imagine not being able to physically be there.
Yeah. Trauma, when it comes to kind of war or really intense things like torture, sometimes is called like wounded hearts, right? Or
like a moral injury, or
like a moral or a soul injury. And when they were looking at trauma that people who served in Vietnam had, they found that people who were like the cooks had more trauma than people who were on the front lines of the fighting, because they felt help, they heard the things, but they couldn't participate in the thing. And so they always worried about a thing, or they were worried about who was going to come back and who wasn't going to come back. And there's just ways in which our not being able to know the full story is a part of what sticks with us. And that's when we think about the ways that first responders or people who work in cities or people who experience emergencies so often that they need a ritualized way of caring for themselves. Part of what they do is within a certain number of hours, usually within 72 hours, to make sure you get as many voices telling the story so you have a fuller picture. So that at 3 a.m, when your brain goes, oh, but what about this? Oh, but what about this? Hopefully in a group of everyone saying what they remembered and what they heard and what they smelled, that you'll check off some of those things your brain wants to wake you up at 3 a.m. about,
puzzle. Right? Yes, it completes the puzzle. That is my favorite part of running debriefings, is I call it the gift of cohesion. It allows people a complete picture, because even if you and I experience the same thing and we're standing next to each other, we're going to interpret it. We're going to see things. We're going to hear things in a completely different way. And so that gift of cohesion is so important for first responders, especially like when I run debriefings. I have the dispatcher there. If the coroner is involved, we try to bring the coroner, like everyone from beginning to end, because like you said, it's so important to have that full picture.
Yeah. And sometimes you might think about your team in a different way because you have that group way of telling the story. You might have been like, oh, that person wasn't helping at all. And what you learn is they were like playing with a kid to make sure that their stress level went down, or they were fielding this issue and doing that other thing, or our own guilt of, I wish I would have helped in this way.
Right.
I bet nobody did that. They might learn, oh, someone did actually help with that.
It's a beautiful thing when you watch people get that cohesion and get questions answered. Why did this happen this way? Why did this decision get made? Oh, and I understand now. It does wonders for the beginning of that trauma recovery stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm appreciative that you've kind of normalized this idea that you can talk about traumas. You can talk about different kinds of traumas. And you have at the end of each of these chapters, for someone like, we're talking in very like, we studied trauma a lot language, but this book is written in very like plain speak, like almost the way you would like tell it to your grandma at the kitchen table. Like, it's not the worst, most triggering details, although again, that depends on what you've experienced in your life. Mm-hmm. But at the end of each chapter, you have this little box, which is like a little prompt of a way that someone can like live that part of the healing process in action. So it's not like, go learn this modality of trauma care and only see your therapist and then do this sort of homework. Like, it's things like journal and figure out your story, or like figure out the ways that just reflect on the fact that you're a resilient human being, and like tell that story as often as you tell the stories of the things you feel guilty about. Right.
Yes. Yeah. And I loved including that. That was a suggestion by my wonderful editor, because I really wanted people to feel like active participants in this book, which is a hard thing to do when I'm, sitting at my desk by myself in COVID times writing a book. I wanted it to feel interactive in a way, but for the reader to really feel like they were given some tools to take an immediate step. And that immediate step isn't go change your life in 10 million ways, go quit your job. It's not that. It's how can we practice taking better care of ourselves and give ourselves that validation and forgive ourselves and those things. And so I get a lot of, the book's only been out a couple weeks, but I hear so much about those end of chapter little action items. So I'm happy you liked them.
Well, what I appreciated about it is that it's like I could see. Well, I don't know if you know this. I'm not sure if it's a secret or like a known thing, but like a lot of people who go to pastor school go to learn about God or about how to care for other people. This is definitely not the same for first responders. But when they learn about how to care for other people, they end up learning how to care for themselves, right?
That makes sense.
And I know first responders do that too. But so like what I appreciated about it is it's like a book you can pick up and be like, I'm going to care for people in my neighborhood. I'm going to care for people in my congregation. I'm going to care for my family who experienced that thing. And then you realize kind of as you're reading, like, oh yeah, I have things that I feel bad about. And you're like, so it's a book that's kind of simultaneously gives you the skills you need to care for other people in the community, but also is like leading you through pondering your own bits of the story, right?
Yes. And that's exactly what I wanted, because I knew there's going to be sort of two types of people that pick up the book. There's going to be the types that are like, this is for me. I have something that I'm working on overcoming and I want some additional tools. Then there's people who pick it up to help someone else, family member, a loved one. But we all have little things. We all have moments of, hurt. And so I wanted it to reach those people who are like, this isn't for me. I'm reading it for someone else. But just have those gentle little, but you can think about yourself too.
All right. I have a section that I've marked that I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, because I think it's something that comes up a lot in conversations I have with people and in some of the like congregations that I've visited about trying to figure out what to do. Oftentimes, us Lutherans, we're rather nice folk, right? Because we read all these things like love is patient and it's kind, it's gentle, and then we try to figure out like what to do. And trauma is something I think that like agitates us. And if we don't care for it, it's like a rock that grinds on our bones and is like, you either pay attention to me or I'm going to wear you away. Right. And in that agitation, it can make us angry. Right.
Sure.
But you talk about anger being a gift that keeps people alive.
Mm-hmm.
And you start talking about some of the things that you're angry about. Like, I'm angry that safety and danger at first look the same. That an environment can be full of good people or have its access centered on a dangerous oppression. And at first, you can't tell, right? I'm angry that some men will only view women's worth based on what she can give them or how attractive they find her. And you go through several things that you're angry about. Can you just speak a little bit about the gift of anger?
Yes, absolutely. My relationship with anger has changed a lot for the better. I used to think, and I think I say this in the book, I used to think that anger and violence were the same thing, or that if you were angry, it meant that you hadn't overcome the thing that you were angry about. And I realized that I will always be angry about the things that happen to me. And that means that I'm still paying attention to it. And that means that I'm still seeing where there are moments and opportunities for improvement and steps that can be taken now. So what happened to me doesn't happen anymore. And I get messages from women firefighters almost every single day sometimes about things that are happening to them in their fire stations. And every single one of those messages makes me angry. The alternative to that anger is apathy. It's, oh, another terrible story. Oh, another, horrible thing that's happening to someone. And when I say each of those messages makes me angry, that doesn't mean you can tell looking at me that I'm angry. It doesn't mean that I yell. It doesn't mean that I destroy things. It doesn't mean that I, become like that. It just means that my anger is serving me to always remind me what is right and what is wrong and what is just and what is not. And every time I hear a terrible story, or every time, someone gets like sexually assaulted at work, I get angry because the opposite of that is empathy, is apathy. And it's important for me to always have that emotion there because it wasn't for a long time. In one of the beginning chapters of the book, I talk about this amazingly brave woman, Terry Gents, who has a great book called Strange Piece of Paradise that I absolutely love. And Terry experienced this horrendous random act of violence in the 70s when she was biking cross country with a friend. And Terry describes this feeling that she had as an easy forgiveness or a cheap grace. And it was this cheap grace that she gave to the person who attacked her because she didn't have the energy to be angry at him when she was still just trying to survive her experiences. And so for me, for a while, I had that cheap grace and this easy forgiveness towards people who had not asked for it or earned it or deserved it at all. But it was my way of ridding myself from this emotion that I didn't have the energy to give. And then when I found my footing in my own trauma recovery, that anger resurfaced in a way that was very motivating for me, in a way that got me on a plane to every corner of this country telling my story so we can make workplaces safer, so we can have different conversations about people that we are letting into our workplace and behaviors that we want to allow and not allow. So anger for me is an important reminder of what we need to be standing up against. And in my work with those messages that I get constantly, it would be very easy to be apathetic or just kind of shut off the emotion that goes to that every time I hear a really terrible story. But anger for me is an important messenger that I always, just try to stay tuned into because it's telling me something about something that I can change or an action that I can take.
I'm kind of going sort of in backwards order because, I mean, in terms of like the layout of the book, in part because I think like as Lutherans, we have tried to commit ourselves to try to decrease gender-based violence and to try to be people who are able to believe victims and to support women or whomever comes forward with stories of ways that they have been disrespected or abused or kind of act swiftly and with care when there's misconduct that happens. And I think knowing that we're allowed to be angry and knowing that anger is a part of the process, I think if we know that first, it makes it a little bit easier to sit with the discomfort that we need to be able to sit with in order to not be defensive or anxious or to scare away people who are going to be so very, very brave to come forward and let us know that they've been victims of something.
Yeah.
And you sort of speak about all that goes into what it takes for you personally to have gotten to the point where you could report people and may no one on this planet ever use the word may boys be boys or may right, do any of those kind of nonsense comments ever again, right? But I think there is a way in which if we are going to proclaim ourselves as people seeking to decrease gender-based violence, that we also need to be people who are ready and able to sit with the anger that people have about this,
Yes.
to be able to sit with the shame that people have when they falsely believe that they somehow contributed to their own becoming a victim. Yes. And I think to be able to sit in a way that supports people who are terrified about what will happen if they do share their stories. And you write, an almost universal feeling for survivors of sexual or gender-based trauma is that they fear not being believed. And it's not hard to see why, because that's so often what we are met with. It's easier to hate the truth tellers instead of the truth. And we can turn that hate onto ourselves. And I am particularly interested as a bishop, as someone who is a place where people can kind of bring complaints of things that have happened. I particularly want it to be known that I'm someone who will be able to receive that. But I also want all of our almost 200 congregations to be able to be spaces that are able to believe victims and to provide them with care. Do you have thoughts about ways that people in general, but maybe people in faith also can be showing that we are ready and seeking to be safer people that people can bring stories like this to?
Yes, I love that question. And I think a lot about words that we use when we're maybe not aware of all the people that might be listening to us. And what I mean by that is I think of social media sometimes. XYZ happens and your aunt is writing a, dissertation on how I don't believe this woman or this whatever. That celebrity's never going to see what your aunt is writing, but a family member who experienced something different or something similar now knows, oh, that's someone who I'm never going to be able to talk to. I think of that a lot with fathers and their daughters when Me Too, when that was really at the forefront of our sort of cultural consciousness. I was in and out of firehouses a lot during that time, with firefighters' daughters who are around, and to hear the comments that those men were saying, I was hearing it through their daughter's ears of, she now knows she can never tell you anything like this that is going to happen to her because she already knows what your stance is going to be. And so I think about that as well in our congregations or in our communities, just being mindful of the words that we're using when we are talking about survivorship, whether that's because there was something big that came up in the media and everyone is talking about, do we believe her? Do we not believe her? Whatever it is, we all, would maybe like to just get up and like blanket statement, hi, I am a safe person. I will believe you. I am a space to receive all stories. But in lieu of that, I think something that goes a long way is just being really mindful of the words that we use when we're talking about things like that, because you never know who might be listening. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a firehouse or in a dispatch center or on the scene of a call, and I, do my 5-minute spiel on critical incident stress management and here's some things to look out for yourself in the next 24 hours. Here's how to support yourself. And I always make myself available one-on-one for people to talk after. And it just never ceases to amaze me, the people that I think were listening the least, the people that were, on their phone, distracting people who were next to them. They'll call me a week or a month later because they were listening to what I had to say. And so I think that just applies to us always, is just really thinking about who might be hearing me and what sort of message am I telling them about, what sort of stories about them I'm ready to receive.
Well, and when we statistically are honest, I think it's nearly all people who are socialized and raised as female have had experiences of sexual violence, or sexual misconduct, or being catcalled, or feeling like they weren't sure if at work they were going to be treated equally. And it's getting pretty close to a similar number of people who were socialized male who were also experiencing some of these gender-based ways that they have been mistreated. And to just assume that every person you are talking to carries some sort of trauma, whether it's their own or someone they've known or cared about or loved or their family members, that it's there. And to speak as if we're surrounded by victims always, rather than assuming that it's a thing we're studying about in case someone comes to us at some point. Like I have had people who have experienced sexual misconduct in my family, and I am also a victim. I have had a partner who has punched me, and I did not know what to do, right? And so I wish in all of those instances I had more capability and ability to report things sooner, or I felt like so many people had told me, if you report these things, they'll be worse for you because of identities. And I can spend my life wishing that I was more resourced, or wondering if I am to blame for all of the stuff that I know now I could have done differently. Or I can spend my time trying to be the kind of person someone could report to, or be a mentor to people to not put up with whatever it is that they would be putting up with, or to be someone to say, these are you can wear whatever you want, or to be like, I wish I could have been someone in your story to be like, have whatever hairstyle you want to have, right? Like, Because even if you
Right.
see it coming doesn't mean you deserved it,
No, not at
right?
all. Yes, and that was so much a part of my forgiveness of myself, which was where I really needed to start, for not having a crystal ball, as if that makes us responsible for things. But I was looking, so I needed a place to place blame. I needed a place to put my anger, and putting it at just like an entire profession, or the patriarchy, like that just felt too big, and there's no face on that. And so I put that anger on myself because I was the most accessible. And so much of my work in the beginning was about exactly that. I can spend time being angry that I didn't know what I know now, or I can put that energy into making it better for other people. And one of them serves me and one of them doesn't.
Right. Yeah, and I was gonna ask you, like, because there's a chapter that's about how you come to the position to be able to share your story and report it, but I feel like it's a ridiculous question to ask how you came to the space to be able to report it, because you had to do that more than once because people didn't care or didn't treat it with the seriousness that it deserved. Like to literally climb into the backseat of a police car to report an assault to them and then have them say, sounds about right. Right. And those weren't the words, but
Close.
do you know what I mean? Yeah. But
Yeah.
to be able to like continue to report until it's taken seriously, because that's not only what you deserve, but the kind of workplace the next people deserve. And I think really critical in that story is the fact that you, not in the places where you were physically working, but you sought out colleagues and colleagues sought out you, people in the firefighting profession. And for me, that's really important because, with 180-ish congregations, being good colleagues to each other matters, even if you don't live next to each other, because you never know whose story you're validating. That a colleague who is listening, who is separated by geography, was kind of, at least in the way you framed it in this story, it was everything, right? Are you willing to talk a little bit about connecting with colleagues in different spaces?
Yes. I mean, there's a couple different examples in there. We'll see if we're talking about the same one. But I think one of the gifts of sharing my story so publicly is that gift of connection. And every time I tell my story, whether it's through my camera or it's on a stage in front of a couple thousand people, every time I do that and the world continues to spin and the ground doesn't open up and swallow me whole, it's giving people permission to do the same thing in their own life. But what that also means is I am a very public face of a story that people do not always want to hear. And going back to that quote that you spoke about before, in our society, we hate the truth tellers instead of hating the truth. Hating the truth feels too big. We don't know what to do about work environments like the one I found myself in. And so we hate the person telling the truth because it feels easier. And, we discredit them and we discount them. And so the gift of telling my story for me has been finding a community of people who have experienced something similar to me, that hearing my story helps them feel not alone. And most people will never, ever want to get up on a stage and talk about what happened to them. That's like not the goal, and it shouldn't be the goal for everybody. That's like not necessary to have overcome something. But every time I do it, I'm giving people permission to do the same thing, even if it's just telling their story to themselves. Can you tell me a little bit more about which example you're thinking of so I can speak to it?
Oh, well, I mean, as a chaplain of the San Francisco first responders, I got to give a shout out to the San Francisco Fire Department. Come on.
Shouts out. Yes. Okay. Yes. I would love to talk about that. So there was a point in my early fire service career where I was really sort of at a crossroads. I had had about 3 years in the job. I had experienced a sexual assault. I had experienced just the worst of people. Yet I had still been able to, truly by the grace of God, separate out the fire service and the goodness and the purity of that and the people that I was doing that job with. And so I needed a win. I needed to meet firefighters who were nice, firefighters who I was safe around, firefighters who did not care about my gender. And my sibling was at the orthodontist office, and my mom was reading Time magazine. And there was an interview with the chief of the San Francisco Fire Department, who was a woman. And my mom came home and said, "Allie, you are never going to believe." And it was like, I was like, is this real? Is this woman real? And I found her like secretary's email somehow through a weird Google search, and emailed this person who kindly emailed me back. And I found myself on the phone with the chief of the San Francisco Fire Department, who's like, Beyonce level. And I now have such a greater appreciation for like what her schedule must have been, and the fact that she took the time to talk to me. And I just asked questions, mostly like, how did you do this? How did you survive in this? Because I've had a hell of a time. And not only did she take that time to talk to me, she invited me to come to San Francisco for an entire week. And I lived in firehouses, and I met every single woman firefighter that they had working there that entire week. And for the first time in my whole life, I was in firehouses and did not feel fear. I was in firehouses and on fire boats and on fire trucks, and just felt like this is what I hoped existed. And so that experience gave me permission to keep going. And it gave me the validation that what I'm looking for does exist. I just have to keep going. So San Francisco and those firefighters will always have the best, biggest place in my heart.
Well, and I think, and they started you off at like Station 34, which is like the base station where they just take you on cool boat rides and show off with their little water cannons and stuff, right?
We went around Alcatraz.
They have all the toys.
It was just the most, it was Station 35 that has the Phoenix and the Guardian, the fireboats. And it was just such a memorable experience. And the name of my first book, Where Hope Lives, actually came from, I wrote an essay in college, and the prompt was like, write about the best day of your life or something like that. And I wrote about my experience in San Francisco. And I said, in the city where hope lives, the sun is always shining. And then when I went on to write a book about those early experiences, that's where I got the title for the book.
So shout out SFFD.
Shout out. Good job. Love you all.
Good job, Chief. You talk about something that I think not everyone thinks about when they think about trauma, because I think most people think about like big impact stuff or grief when they're thinking about trauma. And you talk a little bit about like cumulative stress, which for those of you who don't know, first responders save victims. They're not victims, so they don't get trauma. They just have a lot of stress. So we call the same thing cumulative stress. When you care for first responders. It's very cute. Teachers don't call it trauma when it's kids, especially if it's kids who have experienced poverty. So they call it stress brain, which I also think is cute.
Sure. Great.
And some people call it psychological first aid. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter what you call it or what the name of it is, but I like this idea that you write about long-lasting trauma, or maybe what some people would call like microaggressions, where it's like a small thing happens that either chips you away, or like you talk about it as collecting drops in a bucket that eventually overflows. Can you speak about that a little bit? Because as a parent, I definitely get it. But I also think for people who are experiencing discrimination or are experiencing, like, they are tough people who are trained, and of course they have the capacity for this. Like the fact that you get injured by emergencies is something that makes sense because not everyone can do it. But for people who are very tough and resilient and don't want to feel broken or like a victim, knowing that things can just sort of build up if you're not kind of keeping well, or even if you are keeping well, because bodies are meant to sort of shake it off every once in a while.
Right. Yeah. And that applies to all of us, regardless of what our job is. We all have seasons of life that are more stressful than others. And I think for COVID, that was a long season for all of us that was, had that additional stress in one way or the other. But especially for first responders specifically, take the actual witnessing trauma out of it for a second. We still have constant sleep disruption. When sleep is bad, we do a whole course on the job and off and sleep, because I could talk for days about how important it is. We get real into sleep with on the job and off. But for first responders, that constant sleep disruption is wearing away at your ability to just have a mental and emotional center. So for first responders, that's a constant part of the job. People call 911 at all hours of the day and someone has to show up. So it's not like you can be like, I'm tired, I'm going to sit this one out. So that constant sleep disruption is huge. The adrenaline spikes wear on us chemically. The one of the worst things is, in a busier firehouse, they might get woken up 6 times in a night, for example, and 5 out of those 6 times, before they even get out of the firehouse, the call is canceled. Before they even get out of their bed, the call is canceled. So your adrenaline is through the roof, and it's like, just kidding, go back to sleep. How do we do that? Other things like how that affects our family life, how that affects our ability to show up to our partners, to our spouses, to our children. All of that is existing and is enough to cause maybe a bucket to overflow if we're not doing things really intentionally and perfectly, which no one does it all the time, to empty that bucket. Then you add the actual job of being a first responder, going to see things that sometimes, despite our best efforts, the only thing we are there to do is witness what happened. There is no action that can change the outcome. And that is a space where we land in a lot with critical incident stress management, is like, the cards were dealt and we were just there. What do we do with that experience now? So you add some of those, like, those are bigger drops that come into our bucket. And when we experience sort of like a big T trauma versus a little T trauma, which could be more of those microaggressions, it never happens when things are going perfectly in our lives, right? It always happens when our kids are sick and this and this and this and this. And then we have a big drop in that bucket. And our buckets are going to overflow at times. We're going to have moments where we just need to take everything off our plate as much as possible and do what we can to just rest and rejuvenate. But for first responders, the job aside, it is stressful. And then you add all the things that we are called to see and all the things that we are called to do and things that we are called to try to intervene on. And people don't live all the time. That's just a part of what you learn when you actually start doing the job. I went through EMT school and we're talking about all the most horrendous things that could happen to a human body. And you think that you're going to get there in time every time and you're going to do the right thing every time. And even when you do that, people still die. And those are big drops in our bucket that can cause it to overflow. But, we all have a bucket. We're all collecting drops in it day to day, but most of the time we're doing little things in our day that are helping sort of empty that bucket a little bit. But we all have those buckets, and different things in our life help it feel less full or more full, depending on what's going on. You got me still? Good.
Yeah, I'm jumping in for a little bit while Bishop Megan resets their Wi-Fi.
No problem.
Hi, everyone. Fun to be jumping in. I've just been kind of listening behind the scenes and learning a lot about trauma response. And I'm wondering, especially here in our synod. So we're in Northern California, Northern Nevada, Central California, and there's a fire season is upon us, and being woken up in the middle of the night and being in that trauma, and also dealing with so many environmental things that are beyond our control. I'm wondering what sort of insight you might have for congregations or individuals who kind of experience some of these things that are beyond any of our control a lot of the time, and how to cope with those moments of trauma, and how to live into a healthy response or prepare yourself and your mind and your body for that
Yeah.
sort of response? What comes to mind?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So the first thing that comes to mind is in my work with first responders a couple years ago, I was trying to come up with an acronym for like a really quick way to remember the steps to take for yourself after you've experienced trauma. And so the acronym I came up with was FIRES, are my firefighters. Like,
That's okay.
yeah, right on the nose. But the F in FIRES stands for first acknowledge. First acknowledge to yourself that you experienced something scary. That's a big step for some people, is just acknowledging it to themselves. You don't have to say it to anyone else. So I think in things like that, in really anything, but especially in that situation, it's acknowledge to yourself that something scary happened, even if it sort of becomes normal as we get used to fire seasons and we know when things might be happening. Even if they are happening more often, it's still okay for that to be a thing that's affecting. And so I think to acknowledge that to ourselves, to our family, to our children, to our communities, is acknowledge that that was a really scary thing. Period. The end. You don't always have to add, but we're so lucky, but all, it could be worse. Those things are true. But that was really scary can just be a complete sentence. And we can just sit in that for a little bit and then move on to the reasons why it could have been worse.
Yeah.
And so I think that is something that can be really helpful, is just acknowledging that to ourselves, to our loved ones, is this was scary and hard, and it's okay to feel those feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I also know that this is one of the first conversations where you've had the opportunity to kind of intersect faith and religion into some of your trauma care and first responder life. And so I'm wondering how your faith informs some of the work that you've done. If faith is a part of the work you do, and what that looks like kind of day to day.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was, grew up going to church and knowing who God was sort of just through, how I was taught about it. But I really came to my own relationship with God going through the hardest experience of my life, where I really felt alone and unprepared and unprotected. And I needed to know that there was something bigger beyond just what I could see. And so one of my favorite Bible verses that I had taped to the side of my door every day I would go and leave for the firehouse or go to a call, I had this Bible verse taped up, and it's Ephesians 6:10 through like 18. And I have this firefighter's Bible that I got when I graduated high school that I love and still have. And the gist of that verse is just about taking on the armor of God and being strengthened by God. And I love how it goes through, like, wear your truth like this, wear your righteousness like this, wear your faith like this. And it really, take the helmet of salvation and all of these things. And I love that verse. And that to me has become something that I'm always able to rely on. And I was doing a speaking engagement a couple years ago, and it's always very busy after, and people are giving business cards and talk to me about this and call me about this. And someone put a challenge coin next to me. I still do not know who gave it to me. And I've never spoken about how that verse is really meaningful to me before, ever. And it was a challenge coin of that Bible verse. And I have it with me every single time I talk. And so I think for me, there is no earthly way that I could hold to have a capacity for the stories that I hear, working in child abuse investigations, being there when the worst possible thing happens for first responders who have already a high tolerance. So if I'm there, it's really bad. And just, having the capacity to hear those stories and then not be burdened by them myself. I literally could not do that if I felt like it was ending with me. I literally, before I go to sleep, most nights, but especially after nights that I've dealt with a situation, I literally physically imagine myself taking that memory or that experience or whatever and physically giving it away, because I don't have the capacity to hold it. And I learned that I don't have the capacity to hold these things a long time ago, but I also learned where I can safely place those things. And so my faith is how I can do any of this. Like my second book came out, like we've been talking about, and people they're so complimentary about that, and words that I chose and all these things. And I just feel like it did not come from me. It has my name on it, and my fingers typed it, but it came from something so much bigger. And I'm just so grateful that I have had that to rely on for all of this time, because it just wouldn't have been possible. Like, my trauma would have been the end for me if I didn't have this idea that there was something redeeming it and making it not the end.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, speaking of your book, I'll hold it up for people again. Where can people learn more about you, purchase your book, connect with you? What's the best way for people to get connected?
Absolutely. So it would probably be just through my personal website. It's allywrothrock.com. All the businesses that I run have their own websites. You can get to, I'm very findable on the internet, but if you go to allywrothrock.com, you can get both of my books there. You can learn more about the work that I do. You can watch my TED Talk. You can, see other things about what I've written or what I've spoken on. So yeah, that's the best way to get the book and to connect with me further.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And I know it's a heavy topic, but it's a topic that I always feel more prepared. I feel more enlightened. I feel more equipped to kind of go out in the world after learning from experts like you, and just making it a part of our everyday conversation. So thank you for being here. Is there anything else that you didn't get to share that you would like to share?
I don't think so. The only other thing that I would just love to say is just gratitude and appreciation for having an opportunity to talk about this. It took me a full decade to write after trauma, and that's a lot of time by yourself trying to write a story that you hope matters. And so getting to see it out in the world is just feels like a miracle. And so being able to talk about it and just seeing you hold it is just, it'll never not be cool. So just thanks for the opportunity to share about it.
Yeah, of course. Well, here it is. Once again, feel free to head to Allie's website here and purchase a copy. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Bye.